Morning, good afternoon, and good night, everyone. My name is Vitor Arantes, and I am the Global Nutritionist for Highline International. Today, we're gonna talk some topics on nutrition for optimal eggshell quality, aiming for Highline Browns commercials. So, in today's presentation, we're gonna start with a brief introduction where we're gonna see some aspects of daily calcium flow for laying hens. We're gonna see later some hearing nutritional aspects for optimal development, especially skeleton development. Later on, we're gonna see some production nutrition, especially two very important points: pre-peak, that would be from first egg to peak of production, and also the post-peak nutrition. We're gonna later on discuss a little bit of calcium and phosphorus specific aspects on nutrition. And we're gonna finish our presentations on what we can do inside our farms, some field nutrition to help us to measure and to sustain a good eggshell quality, okay? So, starting with some very important questions. What do we really know about calcium and phosphorus metabolism in laying hens? And actually, this is a very important question because we are every day learning new things on calcium and phosphorus metabolism, and you start to wonder, especially on calcium, why we are talking on available phosphorus. Now digestible phosphorus is a very common, digestible amino acids, but we are still making our nutrition based on total calcium. And actually, the main reason is because we still don't have enough data to formulate, at least in a constant basis, on digestible calcium. So we have some basic questions. A few of them we're gonna see here. Do laying hens have a diurnal change in calcium appetite? That means, do they change their, not only their digestibility and their metabolization of calcium, but do they change the appetite for calcium throughout the day? And if this happens, how much do they change? If this happens, for sure, we have a lot of opportunities with feed management to provide some very specific nutrition advice for our chickens. How the particle size affects the calcium intake and the calcium appetite for those birds. We know that chickens are driven by mechanoreceptors and they eat according to the particle size. They are terrible to feel the taste of the feed. So they eat according to the particle size. So if I change, let's say, to a 100% fine limestone, would they still have the same calcium appetite? So that's something that we need to understand a little bit better. Do they upregulate the acid secretion and the afternoon limestone solubilization? That means we know, and Leeson showed this still on the early 80s, that the calcium appetite and the metabolization can be slightly increased in the afternoon, but does this mean that the solubilization of this limestone is changed according to more acid secretion in the afternoons? If this is true, it's important to understand how our in vivo or in vitro tests can really correlate to in vivo limestone solubility. So we probably need to do some adjustments in our laboratory tests. What is the percentage of the daily calcium intake and absorption that would come from let's say, a supplementary coarse limestone source or a top dressing limestone, and what would come from the diet? It's becoming more and more popular and with very good results to top dress limestone for the chickens, but we really need to understand how this works in terms of sourcing of limestone. For how long after the first calcium intake in the day, the limestone truly needs to stay inside the laying hen gastrointestinal tract? That means, what is the ideal retention time for limestone? Would be the same in the morning, in the afternoon? How can we start to understand what is fast and slow transit in terms of limestone? So that's something that we need to answer as well. How to correlate the percentage of calcium in the manure with the optimal calcium balance? It's very interesting way to understand how we are doing our nutrition, and I'm seeing this quite often in the field, to analyze limestone in the manure and try to correlate with the limestone absorption. It's very interesting, it's very useful, but still need to understand a little bit better how this works or not. And how the calcium nutrition affects the phosphorus requirement. We know that affects a lot. We know that only with some changes in the calcium nutrition, we can decrease in almost half the phosphorus requirement for the birds. So we need to understand this factor a little bit better, but especially how to feed our birds properly. It's pretty easy to do a formula with the ideal calcium intake, with the ideal phosphorus intake, but we also need to go to the farm and see if those birds are really receiving what we are showing on the paper. So a little bit of field nutrition as well, okay? So let's start our presentation talking a little bit of daily calcium flow for laying hens. And we really need to pay a reverence for our chicken, because those animals are extremely efficient in metabolize calcium. And you're gonna see some numbers that are really interesting here. So let's start with a hypothetical 4% calcium in the diet with a 100 grams of feed per bird per day. That would give us a balance of 4,000 milligrams of calcium per bird per day. So if we start what we eliminated in the feces and the urine, we're gonna have about 3120 milligrams there, because we lose about 500 milligrams in the feces, about 380 milligrams in the urine, and so we have a little bit about 3120 milligrams. All of this, of course, happens together. Later on, we have a loss of about 100 milligrams in the bones. So that means, and that's going to be a very important number that we're going to go back later on. Later on, we're going to have a retention in the shell of about 2200 milligrams. So the main balance is here, and we now have remaining 820 milligrams. Now we have about 800 to 850 milligrams that goes to the yolk and albumin of the egg. Sorry, it's covered by my presentation here, but basically now we are going to a 0 milligrams balance of calcium. It's not going to be exactly 0, the final balance. You can have moments of the day where the calcium balance it's going to be positive, and some moments of the day where it's going to be negative. But here we are working with a 0 balance. So let's see a little bit better these numbers. We can start to have some important information here. The first one, this metabolic route here that goes from the feed to the medullary bone, it's very limited. You can see that only about 2.5% of the calcium goes from the feed to the medullary bone. So this starts to show us that it's very difficult to keep fulfilling the medullary bones with calcium, especially in high egg production birds. They will be eventually a little bit more, a little bit less, but almost always in a negative calcium balance in terms of calcium inside the medullary bone. And we can see that about 55% go straight to the eggshell. And we're gonna see later on some important aspects of these two routes here, okay? Now we're gonna see a very interesting point. If we have about 1000 milligrams of calcium inside the medullary bones, and we are not talking about structural bones, trabecular bones, we are talking about medullary bones, we have about 1000 milligrams, and we have a maximum daily depletion of about 100 milligrams. So if we consider that we use about 300 milligrams of calcium in the egg, being majority of this for eggshell, but a little bit for albumin and yolk formation, and let's say an average of 408 eggs in a 100-week average day lifespan, we're gonna have about 1.4 million milligrams of calcium used during this period. That means that they are using about 1,500 times their own reserves of calcium, talking about the medullary bone, for egg production. That's an impressive number. The second most efficient animal to metabolize calcium It's the milk, the dairy cow, and they metabolize about 90 times their own reserves. So you can see how efficient chickens are in terms of calcium metabolization. And that's a really impressive number here. So if we want to ensure a good eggshell quality, I always like to say that eggshell quality is prevention. It's never reaction. When you start to have eggshell quality problems, the majority of the time is already too late. So you need to start from the growing phase, and you need to start to prepare these birds for a longer cycle and to have a good eggshell quality. Everything starts on the development of those birds on the first 2 phases of the multiphasic growth and development. That would be from first week to 5 or 6 weeks. We can see that two very defined peaks here, the digestible system and the immunological system. So if we don't achieve the proper body weight gain during this period, for sure we have already underdevelopment of the digestible system and the immunological system. So those birds will be much more prone to contract any kind of diseases, but they also will have a shorter intestine and less capability to absorb nutrients. This is going to impact not only on the body weight gain on the next phases, but of course on the eggshell quality, because they won't have enough intestinal length to absorb enough limestone. Later on, from 6 to about 12, 13 weeks, we're going to have 90 to 95% of the skeleton development. And here we are building the storage capacity for these birds. So if we don't have a proper body weight gain in this period, we're going to have a shorter bird with limited amount of calcium reserves. And for sure, these calcium reserves won't be able to produce as many eggs as if they had a proper development here. So quite important to build these reserves. Later on, we're going to fill these reserves with calcium, and we're going to talk a little bit of the pre-lay diet, but it's very important to achieve these 2 phases body weight gain. And it's so critical that we even have some publications showing that the body weight at 5 weeks, it's strictly correlated with the majority of the production traits. So we can see here the correlations, and of course, the higher the number, more correlated it is. It's strictly correlated with early production. It's very correlated, much more correlated with persistence of production. It's also going to provide some lower mortality. Of course, if I have a better development of the immunological system, I'm going to have lower mortalities. And if I have a better production and a lower mortality, for sure I'm going to have more hen-housed eggs. So it's very correlated with later hen-housed eggs gain. So it's very critical to achieve this body weight gain. And to achieve this body weight gain on 0 to 5 weeks, what I'm going to show here is some compilation of some strategies that I'm seeing in the field, and also that we are recommending to our customers to better achieve this body weight gain during the first 5 weeks. We are all seeing the benefits here. So the first one, of course, is have a pre-starter in a crumble form. There's several reasons for that, and for me, one of the main one is selection. We know, again, that chickens are driven by mechanoreceptors. They eat according to the particle size. If they have a mash diet, they're going to eat first the grains, any other coarse particle that they have there, and later on, they're going to eat the fines. But if something happens and they don't have time, or they don't have a proper environment to eat the fines, they will start to have an uneven nutrient intake. And that can be very problematic in terms of body weight gain, and especially in terms of uniformity. So when we are providing a crumble diet, we don't give them the possibility to select the particles of the diet. They will need necessary to have an even nutrient intake. So it's very interesting. The ingredient quality, it's a little bit controversy here. We see several papers showing, and used to be a very strict idea that pelletizing diets, you make the starch more available. But it seems that it's not so unanimous concept anymore, but for sure it's something that we need to consider. Some additives that can be added and are usually added to this diet in terms of competitive exclusion makes a lot of sense during this period. Probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, that would be both of them together, especially if we can use some probiotics with organic acids, make a lot of sense during this phase. Enzymes and other additives can be used here. Remember that the old chicks, they have several limitations in terms of endogenous enzymes, especially in terms of lipase. So if you can give any extra exterior help to help them metabolize the diet, it's going to make a lot of sense during this period. In terms of management, lighting program, it's gonna, I won't go so much on the hormonal part here because it's a little bit more management, but in terms of nutrition, it can give us more time. If I go slowly in the stepping down program, it can give us some more time for the birds to eat more and to have more nutrient intake. Of course, this is also going to delay the production a little bit and going to have a bigger egg size, so we need to balance our production goals with our lighting program. And we have some other management points that affects a lot the body weight gain, some stocking density and some environment. And we're going to see a little bit later on some of these points here. On the second point that we said in the growing phase, we talk about the body weight gain from 6 to 12 weeks in the skeleton development. And it's quite interesting to see. This is some internal data from Highline, it's not published, but it's quite interesting to see how the body weight gain from 6 to 12 weeks can affect the total egg number, the egg weights, and the breaking strength. So this was made in a pedigree farm, so ideal growing conditions. So we're gonna see that even that our standards are between 980 milligrams, to 1.02 kilos. Our bottom 15% of body weight, it's already inside our range. And of course, the other body weights are much higher than this. But this can show that we need to have a balance. First of all, we're going to see that even if you get too big or too heavy, you're going to start to lose some egg numbers. You can see that if you are inside the body weight range or up to 3-5% higher than standard, that's the sweet spot here in terms of body weight. Heavier or lighter, you're going to start to lose egg numbers, but you're going to see some very important aspects in terms of egg weight, but especially with breaking strength. So we have the idea in general that controlling the egg weight makes easier to have a better eggshell quality. But this data show us that if I don't have a proper skeleton development, even controlling my egg weight, and I can see here almost a 10% difference in terms of egg weight at 74 weeks, even with these smaller eggs, I have a much worse breaking strength of the egg. Because of course I didn't have the optimal skeleton development and I didn't have enough calcium reserves. So the message here is, if I don't feed those birds well, and if I don't have an optimal skeleton development, even trying to control my egg weight, I'm going to have a bad eggshell quality. Okay, so very, very important. The next point, we need to start to teach our birds how to eat to have a good body weight and a good uniformity during this phase. Here we can see some paper from Leeson, 2005, showing how the energy affects the feed intake and the body weight gain. And we can see that we can have some very good body weight, but we can have a very different feed intake according to our energy profile. So you can see all the treatments here with about 18% of protein, and of course, if you transfer this to amino acids, probably the same levels of amino acid as well. But we see the energy levels from 2650 kilocalories to 3100 kilocalories, and you can see almost 10% change in feed intake. And we still can see that we can have, even with slightly lower energy levels, some very good body weights. So we can balance here, but this also shows that the birds can adapt, and we can have some strategies here for better feed conversion and lower feed intake, or for higher feed intake to have more opportunity for challenging areas and still in both situations achieve some good body weights, okay? A second point is the particle size. As we said, birds eat according to the particle size, but it's also, there's a little bit more in this topic. If I provide a coarser presentation of the diet, I'm gonna have a better development of the gizzard. In special, we can see here for 336 microns to 1100 microns, how my gizzard size increases almost linearly. So this will give much more capacity of feed intake, much more flow capacity of the feed, and this bird is going to be much more prepared for this daily feed intake. Some very important things that we need to see, it's start to compare, especially at the end of the growing phase, the gizzard size with the proventricular size. We want to have at least twice the gizzard size from the proventricular size, and that would be an indication that this chicken have an optimal feed intake capacity. Okay, so we need to make those ladies to eat a little bit better. And next point, the particle size give us some other point here, that is the uneven nutrient intake. As we said at the beginning on the mesh diets versus crumble diets, if we provide mesh diets, sometimes we can provide a situation where the chickens can eat a little bit more of the coarse particle and leave the fines behind. So leaving some space here, about 40 minutes to 1 hour, especially on the later part of the growing phase, and especially during the production phase, as we see on this picture, can help those birds not only to have enough time to consume the fines, as we can see here, to ensure that they are truly eating the fines and not leaving the fines behind every single day and eating just the coarse presentation, but this makes them feel a little bit hungry, and they will eat a little bit better. They will almost have like a compensatory appetite, a compensatory feed intake. So it helps to boost a little bit the feed intake as well. So that's another strategy that should be used, okay? Moving to the next point, whenever we are trying to boost feed intake, it's going to be much easier to have a better uniformity of the flock. And for me, uniformity is the most important indicator in our business here. And we're going to see some points. We have this picture here just to make a little bit of a comparison. If we try to have these two guys here, so these two guys are chickens, and we are providing 200 grams of feed, hoping that they're gonna eat 100 grams each. So can you guys tell me what's gonna happen here? Of course, the big guy, the big chicken, it's gonna eat whatever they want, whatever he wants, and the small chicken here gonna eat what's left for him. So whenever you start to lose uniformity, it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because the dominant bird will keep eating whatever they need. The dominated birds will keep eating just what's available for them. That's why it's not a good strategy for laying hens to try to control the feed intake by inventory. Okay, let's say I have 4 birds per cage and I want 100 grams, I'm gonna give 400 grams of feed and hope that they will divide equally between them. Usually that's not how it happens. So it's very, very important to keep the good uniformity, and that involves a lot of management, selection, and good management, because if I start to lose uniformity, I'm gonna perpetuate this cycle, and I'm gonna start to lose egg weight, and I start to have ununiform egg weight and a lot of problems. We talked about the feed selection already, but let's talk a little bit of a very important point that we see in several countries, that is the cage layout. So we are seeing, and I'm getting very worried with some changes in terms of cage layout. We are seeing that the cages, they are starting to be a little bit deeper in terms of the length here, and they get a little bit more narrow on the front. So that means that you still can have probably the ideal stocking density for these chickens, but for sure you won't have the space of feed, the feeder space per bird. So that's very important. uh, what some cage manufacturers start to see and realize is that if you have a deeper cage and narrow, you can have more chickens per linear meter, so the construction gets cheaper, but of course you start to lose performance. So it makes a lot of difference. Whenever you guys are involved in a new facility project, always pay attention on the feeder space per bird and not only the stocking density. Some other important factor that I'm seeing is the drinker position inside the cage. So makes a huge difference to have, for example, the water line in the front of the cage or in the middle of the cage, or if I have in the back. If it's in the front part of the cage, what's gonna happen is that the dominant chicken, it's gonna drink and eat, drink and eat, drink and eat, and will never leave the front of the cage. So the dominated birds gonna stay behind, and they just gonna eat whenever these guys get tired of eating, drinking, and go to take a walk. So you start to lose a lot of uniformity. On the other hand, if you have the drinkers line in the back part of the cage, what's gonna happen is that these guys are gonna start to eat, gonna feel thirsty, and gonna go to the back part of the bottom part of the cage to drink, and then you give the opportunity to the dominated guys to eat. So it's much easier to achieve a good uniformity. So as we can see, it's not only a matter of nutrition itself, but feed management as well. Okay? So having crossed these points of the first two phases of feed, we're gonna enter in one of the most important points to have a good eggshell quality, that's the pre-lay. The pre-lay, it's important for several reasons. First of all, if we are feeding from grower phase or developer phase, whatever you want, straight to the production phase, we're gonna be changing our diets from 1%, 0.9% of calcium to probably 4.5% of calcium. That's a huge change from one day to another. And this huge change in calcium usually restricts a little bit the feed intake from the birds and can even damage a little bit the feed conversion and the endogenous enzymes activity. So we want to do this a little bit in a smoother way. So the pre-lay, it's going to help us to achieve that because it's an intermediate calcium level, about 2.5 to 2.7% of calcium, and going to make those birds adapt a little bit better to the high calcium levels. A second point is that in the pre-lay is the ideal time for us to introduce the coarse limestone. So it's important for these birds to have contact with coarse limestone before they start the egg production. If we are able to achieve that, it's going to be this chicken is going to be much more efficient in self-regulate the calcium intake according to the calcium requirements. So it's making more feasible for us to top dress calcium and have a self-sustaining calcium intake. Also, it's gonna be some, the pre-lay gonna present us some tool if I wanted to achieve a heavier egg weight or a smaller egg weight, postpone my production or advance my production. We can also manipulate amino acid and energy levels in that way as well. But so ideally, what also gonna be very, very important in terms of pre-lay that I didn't talk, it's can be synchronized with our light stimulation to provide a very uniform onset of production. We always have this question, okay, when to start feeding our pre-lay, and a very common question, when to start light stimulating those birds. So we usually start to stimulate our birds when we start to see some, of course, the body weight is a reference, the body frame is a reference, but in general, we need to pay attention a little bit on the body status of this bird, this body score, comb and crest development, and some other aspects. So if we have a very uniform flock, a good flock, whenever we are light stimulating those birds, we are seeing the first eggs about 10 to 14 days after the light stimulation. And that's exactly the timing that I need to feed those birds the pre-lay. So it makes a lot of sense in some conditions to, whenever I'm achieving the body weight, to stimulate those birds, you're going to start to control a little bit the grower phase or the developer phase feed inventory. When I achieve the body weight to stimulate. I'm gonna light stimulate these birds, and I'm gonna also introduce the prelay. So these birds are gonna eat the prelay for about 10 to 14 days. Thinking about highline brown, they're gonna eat about 0.9 kilos to 1 kilo total prelay diet per bird. And ideally we're gonna have the first egg still under prelay, but at no more than 2% of production, we're gonna shift these birds from prelay to a pre-peak or a layer 1 diet, whatever is the diet. So it makes also very or much easier for us to have a better control of the lighting stimulation and the onset of production. Okay. So after the prelay and at the beginning of production, we're gonna move for me to one of the most important points during production phase. And this point is the pre-picking. That is the period that goes from the first egg until the picking of production. And a lot of stuff gonna happen here, and a lot of stuff can go wrong here and have a very dramatic effect. So this is not a new topic. This is from an article in Poultry World 2016, telling us that in order to facilitate a good start to the laying hens and a development or correcting the effects of suboptimal rearing, nutrient intake should be maximized to prevent the mobilization of nutrient reserves. That means we want to maximize the extraction of nutrients from the diet and not from the reserves. This chicken is gonna eventually achieve peak of production, but they can achieve the peak of production consuming the body reserves or consuming the nutrient that is in the feed. If we are doing consuming the body reserves, for sure we won't have nutrient in the body for the remaining of the production phase, and we won't have a good persistence of production. Okay, so this can be achieved providing a more concentrated feed, assuming that feed intake capacity is a limiting factor, and generally it is a limiting factor. But alternatively, the energy content in this, it's an important point, the energy content can be slightly reduced in the pre-peak in order to stimulate the feed intake. Okay, so it's a very interesting strategy here. We are even seeing here, this is a publication from Tron Nutrition that's quite interesting, showing 3 treatments here. A control diet, where we have a regular level of protein, energy, and vitamins and minerals. Enriched diet, where everything is increased, so protein and amino acids are high, energy is high, vitamins and trace minerals are also high. And then we have the concept of pre-peak diet, as seen on Poultry World here. Higher amino acid and protein levels, lower energy levels, and a higher vitamin and trace mineral level as well. So what gonna happens in terms of results here? This study was split in 19 to 24 and 19 to 32. The main effects we can see between 19 and 24 weeks. We can see the effects of the pre-peak diet in terms of egg production, 4% higher of the average of control and enriched diets, 2% higher egg weight, 5.7% higher egg mass, and a 3.7% better feed conversion. So it makes a lot of sense. And remember that if I have an optimal amino acid intake and a slightly negative energy balance, part of these amino acids can also be used as energy. So it's not a problem until peak of production, okay? Or even sometimes up to 90% of production, you can use this strategy and then go to a regular diet. Makes a lot of sense and works a lot, okay? So during this pre-peak, there's some KPIs here that's important for us to pay attention. And for me, for highline brown, we should try to ensure that at least 16 to 20% of our body weight, actually for highline brown can be almost up to 22% of body weight, is increased from the first egg to the peak of production. 20 to 30% of feed intake increase from the same period, and 16 to 18% egg weight increase. So these KPIs gonna show us what we said before, that the peak of production was achieved without consuming so much of the body reserves. If we achieve this, it showed us that the peak of production was achieved with nutrients from the feed and not from the body reserves. That's why for me, at least, it makes a lot of sense to provide a higher number of diets while my feed intake is increasing. But after my feed intake is steady here, we don't need so much diets anymore. At least not in terms of calcium and phosphorus. We can make some adjustments in terms of amino acids, thinking in egg mass. But for sure, we don't need as many diets as we need during the pre-peak phase. Okay? And if we are talking about the pre-peak, that's an important point here that we pay a lot of attention in amino acids, in energy, even in calcium and phosphorus, but a lot of us are not paying enough attention in the vitamins and trace minerals. So I also like in this period from first egg to peak of production, or for first egg to 90%, or we can even do for first egg to a certain feed intake for highline browns in terms of 100 grams per bird per day, increase in 20 or sometimes 30% in some challenge areas, my premix, my vitamin and trace mineral premix until to overcome this feed intake, right? Remember that these calculations are made for a mature feed intake. So of course, during this beginning of production where the feed intake is restricted and where we need to increase a lot the egg weight, body weight in production, it helps us to have some boost here in terms of vitamins and trace minerals, okay? Moving on, what happened? Froze a little bit, sorry. How to feed these birds is something very interesting. From pre-peak that we see, we're gonna see a little bit of the post-peak. And here it's very, very interesting thing to realize. What I'm showing here, it's the highline brown curves, production curves from 1984 to 2020. And we're gonna see some very interesting aspects here. We're gonna see that our 1984 production curve, the onset of production was around 20, 21 weeks. We had the peak of production with 91, 92% of production, about 30, 31 weeks, and then really fast the production decrease. So we're gonna see that between 1984 and 1998, we had a huge change in terms of onset of production and peak of production. And even the persistence of production here, but especially on this first half, that was the major change that we had from 1984 to 1998. A much faster onset of production and a higher peak. But we can see that from 1998 to 2020, the peak of production was not changed in a very significant way, at least when compared to the previous 15, 20 years. But we can see a dramatic change in the persistence of production. So you can see the yellow line here, that is 1998, and you can see this, I don't know, gray line here, 2020, how the peak of production is not so different, but the persistence of production is dramatically different. To put this in numbers, we can see here. So the amount of weeks that those birds, or not the amount of weeks, sorry, the age that those birds would cross going down the 90% of production. So they peak and they start to go down. So in 1984, at 34 weeks, those birds were crossing from 90% to 89% of production. And if you can see now, at 2020, by guide, we are having at 55 weeks. But we see some field results with some flocks crossing 70, 72, even 75 weeks of age, with production is still higher than 90%. So what it is telling us, the production is being kept high for a longer and longer period. So this brings us some points that it's important for us to reflect. So even that makes a lot of sense to feed our birds in terms of egg production of egg mass, because of course if my production is high and I want to keep that production high, I don't want it to decrease the levels. So let's say my first requirement here, first egg to peak of production, and from peak to 90%, I can be almost to 60 or 70 weeks just in these two requirements here. And that makes sense, yeah, in terms of amino acid and energy, because again, we are trying to keep this production high. But the problem is, What didn't change is that these birds are getting older and older and older, and they are getting less efficient in metabolize, especially the trace minerals, calcium and phosphorus as well. So that's why what we do recommend is, yes, we can feed amino acids and energy according to the egg production or according to egg mass, but calcium and phosphorus need to be fed according to the age of the birds. Because what's happening is they are getting older and older with high production, and they are getting less efficient again in absorbing nutrients, so we need to compensate this. So how this should happen? Let's say if I have my first requirement here, first egg to peak to 33, 33 to 48. So let's say my flock is at 48 weeks of production, of 48 weeks of age, not production, sorry. So it's gonna be on this requirement of calcium and phosphorus. And for sure, my production is still gonna be higher than 90%. So if I cross to 49 weeks and my production is still higher than 90%, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna keep on this requirement of amino acids and energy, but I'm gonna change the calcium and phosphorus to the next requirement. That would be 49 to 62. So I'm gonna increase 0.2% in terms of calcium, and I'm gonna decrease a little bit my available phosphorus or even my digestible phosphorus, like is here. Okay. So again, energy and amino acids can be fed according to egg production or egg mass, but calcium and phosphorus, we need to feed those birds by age, okay? Crucial. Next point on eggshell quality is that we need to change a little bit our mindset. Eggshell quality is not only about eggshell thickness. Actually, we are trying not to select those birds to a very thick eggshell, because what happens if I need a very thick eggshell to have a good eggshell quality, my body reserves of calcium will produce less eggs. On the other hand, if I don't need so much calcium, or if I don't need so much thick eggshell, I don't need so much calcium from the medullary bones, and the amount of calcium reserves can produce more eggs. So what we are trying to do is select birds to have a better flexibility of the shell. So doing an extreme comparison here, we are trying to make the eggshell to act almost like a car's shock absorber here. So we have here the mammillary cones, the calcium mammillary cones, and you have the inner membrane here of the egg. And this should be the way this the mammillary cones attach to the external shell membrane. It should be as smooth as possible here. So this egg can almost receive an impact here, transfer this to the inner membrane, and almost flexibilize and return without being ruptured. So if we are able to achieve this, of course, we're going to have a better eggshell quality without needing so much calcium. So that's why now when we talk about eggshell quality, it's not only about shell thickness, so it's not only about calcium. It's about trace minerals, and it's about amino acids as well, because both of them are going to help with the eggshell flexibility. Okay?